The sun was setting in the quiet suburb, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. A group of teenagers huddled behind a large oak tree, their voices barely above a whisper as they watched the old man across the street. Mr. Howard, as the neighborhood called him, was mowing his lawn at a steady pace, seemingly unaware of the group of teens watching him. His white hair and slow, methodical movements made him the perfect target. Or so Jake thought. "This is going to be too easy," Jake smirked, glancing at his friends. "Old man Howard won't even see it coming." The group chuckled in agreement, their excitement building. They had spent the entire afternoon planning the perfect prank, and now it was time to put it into action. But as Jake turned back toward Mr. Howard, he noticed something strange. The old man had stopped mowing and was now looking in their direction. For a split second, Jake thought he saw a faint smile cross the old man's face. "Nah," Jake muttered to himself. "He doesn't know what's coming." The group moved into action, confident that this would be the prank of the year. Little did they know, they were about to be outsmarted in the best possible way. As dusk settled in and the streetlights flickered to life, the group of teenagers moved with the stealth of a military operation. Or at least that's how they imagined it. Jake, leading the charge, crept around the side of Mr. Howard's house, followed closely by his best friends, Tommy, Lucy, and Ben. "Remember," Jake whispered, "we've got to stay quiet. Old man Howard's probably inside by now, winding down for the night." Lucy, always the cautious one, bit her lip. "You sure this is a good idea? I mean, he seems nice enough." Jake rolled his eyes. "Nice or not, this is going to be hilarious." The plan was simple. The teenagers had brought along an arsenal of prank supplies: plastic wrap to cover his front door, itching powder for his gardening gloves, and fake worms to stuff in his mailbox. They had it all mapped out. Quick, harmless, and just embarrassing enough to leave the old man scratching his head for days. The first stage of the prank went off without a hitch. Tommy expertly stretched the clear plastic wrap across Mr. Howard's front door, making it nearly invisible in the dim light. Meanwhile, Ben tiptoed toward the gardening shed, his hands trembling as he carefully dusted itching powder onto the handle of Mr. Howard's gloves. "Perfect," Jake whispered to the group as he stuffed the last fake worm into the mailbox. "By morning, he won't know what hit him." But just as they were about to retreat, something caught their attention. The front door opened. The group froze in place, hearts pounding, as the old man stepped out onto his porch. Mr. Howard, still in his work clothes and carrying a watering can, didn't seem the least bit concerned. In fact, he looked downright calm. Jake crouched lower behind a nearby bush, barely able to contain his excitement. "Stay down," he hissed. "He's going to walk right into it." The teenagers watched with bated breath as Mr. Howard approached the door. Just as his hand reached for the doorknob, he paused. Without skipping a beat, the old man took a slight step back, then reached out and gingerly peeled the plastic wrap from the door as if he'd known it was there all along. Tommy's eyes widened in disbelief. "How did he see that?" Lucy shot Jake a nervous glance. "He must have noticed it earlier." But Jake wasn't having it. "No way. He's just lucky. Let's see what happens with the mailbox." The group huddled closer as Mr. Howard, humming a tune under his breath, casually strolled to the end of his driveway. As he opened the mailbox, the fake worms tumbled out, landing in the grass around his feet. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to the teens' astonishment, Mr. Howard chuckled. He bent down, picked up one of the rubber worms, and inspected it with a grin before tossing it back into the mailbox. The teenagers' jaws dropped. "He's laughing?" Ben whispered in disbelief. Jake clenched his fists, his face turning red. "Okay, so he thinks it's funny, but we've still got the itching powder." They watched intently as Mr. Howard made his way to the gardening shed, whistling all the while. But instead of putting on his gloves like they expected, Mr. Howard simply hung the watering can on a hook, glanced toward the group's hiding spot with a knowing look, and called out, "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" The teenagers ducked, panic setting in. Did he see them? They remained crouched in silence for what felt like hours until Mr. Howard finally went back inside, closing the door behind him. Jake's heart was racing. "He saw us," he muttered, his face pale. "How did he see us?" Ben, shaking his head in disbelief, whispered, "Do you think he knows?" "I don't know," Jake said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But one thing's for sure, something's up with that old man." The next morning, the group met at their usual spot by the park just down the street from Mr. Howard's house. Despite their carefully laid plans, they were still baffled by how effortlessly Mr. Howard had dodged their pranks. Jake was especially quiet, replaying the events over and over in his head. "There's no way he could have known," Jake muttered, kicking at the gravel beneath his feet. "We were careful." Tommy shrugged. "Maybe he's just one of those old guys who's always on the lookout." Lucy frowned. "Or maybe we underestimated him." As they debated, Mr. Howard strolled past them, carrying a basket of groceries. He nodded in their direction, a friendly smile on his face. "Morning, kids," he called cheerfully, his voice full of warmth. "Hope you're enjoying the day." Jake barely managed a forced smile as the old man walked away. Something about Mr. Howard's demeanor was bothering him. No, it was more than that. It was as if the old man had been toying with them the entire time. "We have to step up our game," Jake finally said, determination filling his voice. "He's messing with us." Lucy crossed her arms. "Or maybe we should just call it quits before we end up looking stupid." But Jake wasn't ready to give up. "No way. We've got to prove we can outsmart him." That afternoon, the group devised an even more elaborate plan. A prank that would catch Mr. Howard off guard for sure. This time, they would use technology. Ben, the group's resident tech whiz, rigged up a simple remote control that would cause a loud noise in Mr. Howard's garage when activated. The plan was to lure him into the garage, confuse him with the sound, and then prank him once his back was turned. Later that evening, the group gathered near Mr. Howard's house again. The old man was sitting on his porch, sipping a cup of tea, as if he didn't have a care in the world. "All right, Ben," Jake whispered. "On my signal." Ben held the remote, his thumb hovering over the button. Jake counted down, the excitement building. 3, 2, 1. Ben pressed the button. The sound of a loud crash echoed from the garage just as planned. Mr. Howard jumped slightly, his head turning toward the noise. But instead of rushing to investigate, he calmly set down his cup of tea and chuckled. "Guess the raccoons are back," he muttered to himself, getting up from his chair. The group exchanged confused glances. How could he be so calm? As Mr. Howard disappeared into the garage, Jake nodded to the others. "Now's our chance. Let's get into position." But as they crept toward the garage, something unexpected happened. Before they could even get inside, the garage door slammed shut, locking them out. Jake's eyes widened. "What the?" From inside the garage, they heard Mr. Howard whistling a cheerful tune. Then, to their utter disbelief, the sound of the remote-controlled crash played again, this time from inside the house. "How is he doing that?" Lucy whispered, her voice shaking. Before they could figure it out, Mr. Howard reappeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Looks like the joke's on you, kids." Stunned, the group stood frozen in their tracks as Mr. Howard casually walked past them, his usual friendly smile playing on his lips. Jake finally found his voice. "Wait, how did you—" Mr. Howard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You think I don't know a prank when I see one? You kids have been good, but I've been pulling tricks longer than you've been alive." Tommy's jaw dropped. You knew the whole time?" Mr. Howard gave a playful wink. "I was a school teacher for 30 years, and let me tell you, kids are always up to something. I know a prank when it's coming from a mile away." Jake's face turned red with embarrassment. He had never expected to be outsmarted by someone like Mr. Howard, but there was no denying it now. The old man had been playing them from the start. Lucy laughed, breaking the tension. "Guess we met our match." Mr. Howard leaned in slightly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "If you kids really want to learn how to prank, I might be able to teach you a few things." And with that, the tables had officially turned. The teenagers, once sure of their victory, now found themselves learning from the very man they had tried to outsmart. Over the next few days, the group couldn't stop talking about Mr. Howard. The tables had turned in a way none of them expected, and instead of feeling defeated, they were intrigued. Jake, who had been the most determined to prank the old man, now found himself fascinated by Mr. Howard's cleverness. One afternoon, they decided to take Mr. Howard up on his offer. The group gathered outside his house and knocked on the door. Mr. Howard answered with his usual friendly smile. "Well, well," he said, opening the door wide. "I was wondering when you'd come back. Come on in, kid." The teenagers shuffled inside, still feeling slightly embarrassed but eager to learn from someone who had clearly mastered the art of outwitting them. Mr. Howard led them to his living room, where he had laid out an old photo album and some other trinkets from his past. "I thought you might want to know a bit about the man you've been trying to prank," he said with a chuckle. "You see, I wasn't always this gray-haired guy sitting on the porch. Back in the day, I was a teacher, and believe me, I had my fair share of mischievous students. And let me tell you something. When you've dealt with pranksters for as long as I have, you learn a few things." Jake, trying to mask his curiosity, raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying you've been pranked before?" "Oh, hundreds of times," Mr. Howard said with a grin. "But the trick is learning how to turn the prank back on the prankster. That's the real art. You've got to stay calm, think ahead, and always be ready to outsmart them." The group leaned in closer, captivated. Mr. Howard flipped through the photo album, showing them pictures of his days as a young man. In one photo, he was surrounded by a group of students, all laughing, while Mr. Howard stood in front of a chalkboard covered in jokes. "See, it's all about timing," Mr. Howard continued. "It's not just about pulling the prank. It's about knowing when to pull it and how to get the best reaction. And always, always make sure it's harmless and fun." Lucy, the most cautious of the group, spoke up. "But what if the prank goes too far? Like, what if someone gets hurt?" Mr. Howard nodded solemnly. "That's the difference between a good prank and a bad one. A good prank should never hurt anyone, physically or emotionally. You want people to laugh with you, not at you. That's a lesson I learned the hard way." The room fell quiet as Mr. Howard's tone became serious. He closed the photo album and looked at the group. "I once pulled a prank on a friend of mine when I was your age. It seemed harmless at the time, just a bit of fun, but it ended up embarrassing him in front of everyone, and he stopped talking to me for a long time. That's when I realized that pranks aren't just about tricking people. They're about understanding how your actions affect others." Jake, who had been listening intently, nodded. "So, it's like respect?" "Exactly," Mr. Howard said, smiling. "Respect. If you respect the person you're pranking, you'll always make sure it's something they can laugh about afterward." With this new understanding, the teenagers were eager to learn the tricks of the trade. Mr. Howard showed them how to pull off pranks that were clever, thoughtful, and, most importantly, fun for everyone involved. He even taught them a few classic tricks, like how to make a whoopee cushion sound realistic without anyone noticing, or how to set up a simple but hilarious surprise using harmless props. The group quickly realized that pranking was more than just setting traps. It was about timing, creativity, and knowing your audience. Mr. Howard made it clear that the best pranks were the ones that left everyone laughing, even the person being pranked. Over the next few weeks, the group began to see pranking in a new light. They stopped focusing on embarrassing people and started thinking of ways to pull off clever surprises that would leave their friends, and even their teachers, grinning. Jake, who had once been the most eager to prank Mr. Howard, now saw the old man as a mentor. "You've really got this whole thing down to an art," Jake admitted one day as they sat on Mr. Howard's porch watching the sunset. Mr. Howard chuckled. "It's all about perspective. Pranks, like life, are more enjoyable when everyone is in on the fun. That's the key." The teenagers took his words to heart, especially Jake. He started to think about pranks differently, realizing they were more than just cheap laughs. They could be a way to build friendships, create memories, and, most importantly, have a good time without hurting anyone. With Mr. Howard's guidance, the group became known around the neighborhood as pranksters, but in a good way. They pulled off harmless pranks that left people smiling instead of fuming. They rigged up surprise parties, planted fake but hilarious notes in mailboxes, and even set up a town-wide scavenger hunt that had everyone participating, from kids to adults. The best part? Mr. Howard was in on it all. He became their secret ally, always offering advice and coming up with new ideas for their next big prank. One day, as they sat in Mr. Howard's living room planning their latest scheme, Lucy leaned over and asked, "So, do you have one last big prank in mind for us?" Mr. Howard smiled mischievously. "Actually, I've been saving something special. I've been planning this one for years, but I've been waiting for the right partners to pull it off." The group's eyes widened. "What is it?" Tommy asked, his voice full of anticipation. Mr. Howard leaned in close, lowering his voice to a whisper. "It's something that's going to bring the whole town together, but it's going to take a lot of planning. You in?" Jake and the others nodded eagerly. "We're in." For the next several weeks, the group worked closely with Mr. Howard to plan the ultimate prank, something that would leave the entire town talking, but in the best possible way. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the help of local businesses, schools, and even the mayor's office. The day finally arrived, and the prank unfolded perfectly. As the townspeople went about their daily lives, they were met with a series of fun surprises. A parade of rubber ducks floating down the main street, harmless confetti cannons going off at random, and a town-wide scavenger hunt that led to the town square, where everyone gathered for the grand finale. Mr. Howard, with the help of the teenagers, had set up a massive screen in the town square. As the crowd gathered, laughing and sharing stories about the day's pranks, the screen lit up, showing a video message from Mr. Howard himself. "Good evening, everyone," Mr. Howard said with a wink. "I hope you've all had a good laugh today. But remember, pranks are about fun, not embarrassment. And the best pranks are the ones that bring people together." The crowd cheered, and the teenagers couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished. They had learned from the best, and they had pulled off a prank that would go down in town history, not for its tricks, but for its heart. As the crowd dispersed, Mr. Howard turned to the teenagers, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You kids did good," he said. "This town hasn't had this much fun in years." Jake smiled. "We couldn't have done it without you." Mr. Howard shook his head. "No, you could have. You've all got it in you. You just needed a little nudge." The group lingered for a moment, realizing that their time as Mr. Howard's apprentices was coming to an end. But the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. "You know," Mr. Howard said, his voice softening, "I think it's time for me to pass the torch. You kids have what it takes to keep this town laughing. Just remember, respect, creativity, and timing." Jake nodded. "We won't forget." As the teenagers walked away, they knew that their days of pranking were far from over. But now, thanks to Mr. Howard, they understood the true art of a good prank and the power it had to bring people together. The next morning, the town was still buzzing with excitement. People were sharing stories about the day's pranks, and Mr. Howard had become a local legend. As the teenagers reflected on the journey they had been on, they realized how much they had grown. They weren't just pranksters anymore. They were part of something bigger. Before they left town for the day, Jake and the others stopped by Mr. Howard's house one last time. As they approached the porch, they found a small note pinned to the door. "Thanks for the laughs. Keep the fun going. Mr. H." The group smiled, knowing they would carry on his legacy in their own way. If this story made you smile or reminded you of the importance of fun and creativity, don't forget to share it with others. Pranks, when done right, can bring people together and create memories that last a lifetime. For more heartwarming and humorous stories, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next great adventure.